On May 23, 2011, a 26-year-old woman named Jamie Miner was working at a fancy restaurant in Austin, Texas. That night, something seemed to come over Jamie, and she began acting erratic, according to her coworkers. So erratic, in fact, that her boss told her she had to go home. And so some of Jamie's coworkers decided they would call one of her friends to come pick her up because they were concerned Jamie could not get home under her own power. But it would later turn out that when that friend showed up at the restaurant to get Jamie, Jamie wasn't there. And so the friend tried calling Jamie and looking for Jamie, but she was nowhere to be found. When the next day Jamie had still not come home, Jamie's friends and family began calling around and asking if anybody knew where she was, but no one seemed to know. And so the parents filed a missing person report and then began putting up flyers all over Austin in hopes that someone would recognize her and call in with some information. But over the next several weeks, after the police have launched their own search, no one came forward with any information about Jamie. Then on June 29th, so 37 days after Jamie has gone missing, a worker found some of Jamie's personal belongings inside of a parking garage about a half-mile away from Jamie's restaurant. This discovery prompted police to pull the surveillance footage not only from the parking garage, but from neighboring businesses. And what they saw on all of this footage was on the night Jamie was supposed to be getting picked up by her friend, she instead shows up on camera trying to get in the side door of a steakhouse located right next to that parking garage. The steakhouse was called Perry's, and Jamie used to work there. So Jamie tries the side door, it doesn't work, so she makes her way into the parking garage and tries a door on the back of the restaurant, but that also doesn't work. Then, for reasons no one fully understands, Jamie made her way up to the third floor of this parking garage, where she managed to pull off the cover to this huge air duct and then climbed inside. This air duct did eventually connect down to the steakhouse Perry's on the first floor, but in order to get down there, you would need to navigate these very tight and steep sections of pipe, and the inside of this air duct gets to be over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The security footage only showed Jamie climbing into the duct. They didn't have footage of her leaving the duct. So the police made their way over to Perry's and this parking garage, and they get inside the air duct and they find Jamie. She had managed to climb through the ducts from the third floor all the way down to the section of duct that was between the first floor and the second floor. There, she had tried to go down this very steep section of pipe, and after getting to the bottom of it, she could not make the tight turn through the pipe. Her body just could not contort around the turn. But unfortunately, going back up it was impossible. It was too steep, it was too narrow, and there's nothing to grab onto. Jamie almost certainly began screaming for help, but the section of pipe she got stuck in was located in a building just off of the parking garage that was more or less abandoned, and so no one would have heard her. It's unclear how long Jamie was alive inside of that air duct, but eventually she died of hyperthermia, or overheating. While no one knows for sure why Jamie acted the way she did on the night she went missing, it was determined in her toxicology report that she had LSD in her liver. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogenic. During a busy 2009 weekend on a popular river in Florida, two boats collided. Within minutes, one of them, a 40-foot-long pleasure craft, had sank. Luckily, all the passengers on both boats survived, but unluckily, where the sunk boat finally landed underwater was not very deep, and it was just barely outside of a main shipping channel, which meant if it didn't get moved, someone was eventually going to run into it. The marina owner contacted a local commercial diver and asked him if he would come out and lift this boat up and move it, but that diver was not going to be available for several weeks, and he was asking for too much money. So the marina owner reached out to another local diver, a guy by the name of Tim, and offered him the job. Tim was not a commercial diver. He was a 43-year-old recreational diver who was well known in the area and had lots of diving experience. But in terms of experience lifting 40-foot crafts off the bottom of the river, Tim had no experience. But Tim was excited at this challenge being presented to him, and so he accepted the deal and offered to do it for half the money the commercial diver was asking for. Even though Tim had never raised a boat before, he knew it was going to require a lot of lift bags around the boat. Lift bags are like these big, durable balloons that you can inflate and deflate underwater. But before Tim could just go down and start placing these bags, he needed to do a survey dive where he just went down and checked out the wreckage, saw it for himself, and figured out how many lift bags he would need and where he would place them. So on September 12th, Tim threw all of his dive gear into his truck, he left the marina and drove over to a parking lot that butted up against the shipping channel. Tim hopped out, leaving his gear in the truck. He walked down to the edge of the riverbank and he scanned out across the river looking for the buoy that the marina owner had told him was out there, designating where the shipwreck was. Once he found it and saw that it was not very far from where he was, he just walked back up to his truck, grabbed his gear, came back down to the water's edge. He jocked up, then hopped in the water and swam out to the buoy. Once he was there, he placed his diver down flag on the buoy. This is a flag that signifies to anybody in the area that there is a diver below them, and then he made his descent. Tim didn't expect to be underwater for very long, and because he was a very experienced diver, he probably thought this dive was going to be extremely routine. And so for those reasons, he had elected not to bring a dive partner with him. This is a huge no-no in the diving community, especially if you're going to be diving in a hazardous environment like a shipwreck. But Tim was confident, so he broke that rule. One of the pieces of gear that Tim had brought with him was a diver propulsion vehicle, or DPV for short. These DPVs come in all shapes and sizes, but what you should picture in your head is like a little torpedo with a propeller on the back, and the diver holds on to this torpedo and controls the speed using a throttle and basically just rockets around underwater. The current in the river that Tim was going to be in was fairly strong, and so Tim brought his DPV to help him stay near the shipwreck as he inspected it. After Tim went subsurface, he grabbed his scooter and began going straight down, and the water was not very clear, so he couldn't see the shipwreck at first. But after going down about 50 feet, he saw this beautiful boat. It was perched on its side on this fairly steep embankment with its nose pointing in the direction the current was flowing. Right away, Tim got to work swimming around the shipwreck, looking for different points on the boat where he could attach lift bags and marking those locations on his diver's slate, which is like a dry erase board. But after going around the boat several times, Tim had not seen the actual impact site on the side of the boat that caused it to sink in the first place, and he wondered if it was hidden on the side of the boat that was laying in the sand. And so Tim decided he wanted to go down and have a look, and so he went down to where the sand met the boat, but as soon as he got down there, he kicked up all the mud and the sand and it killed his visibility. And so he grabbed onto the side of the boat and he picked up his DPV and turned it on with the propellers pointed back towards where the mud and the sand was, and he kind of used the propellers of the DPV like a leaf blower and blew the mud and sand out of his field of vision. And it worked great, but he couldn't see the impact site. And so he got underneath the boat and got closer and closer to where the actual metal of the boat was pressing up against the sand and just continued to blow away the mud and sand to get a better look, when all of a sudden the ship lurched forward and came to a stop on Tim's legs. He couldn't move, he was totally trapped. When Tim had used his DPV to clear away the mud and sand, he had also blown away some of the mud and sand that was keeping the boat from sliding farther down the embankment. And so when it got blown away, the boat became unsteady and it came to rest on top of Tim. When Tim was not able to pull his legs out from under this incredibly heavy boat, he most likely used the DPV to continue to erode the mud and sand around the boat to try to get it to continue to slide down off of his legs. But he wasn't able to do that because the boat was basically wedged up against his legs. Tim's legs were the thing keeping the boat from sliding any farther. And because Tim did not bring a dive partner, there was literally no one there to save him. And even though he had told the marina owner that he was going out to survey the wreck, he had not given his timeline, so no one was expecting him. And so he would have realized very quickly that there was virtually nothing he could do but wait to die. Several hours later, someone on the surface noticed Tim's diver down flag on that buoy and called in the authorities. When the fire department's dive team went down to the wreckage, they found Tim. He was still trapped underneath the boat. He had run out of air and he had drowned. From a young age, Carrie O'Connor had an intense love of learning. When she learned how to read, her parents had to bribe her to get her to put her book down so she would go outside and play with the other kids. While Carrie loved to learn about all things, her favorite subject was French culture. And so she began devouring all things French, and then in middle school she began studying the language, and by high school she was nearly fluent and taking college-level French courses. Carrie would go on to earn several degrees in French, including a PhD. And in 2019, 2019, she put that PhD to use when she was offered a full-time professorship at Boston University. She eagerly accepted the role. After her first full year at BU, she decided it was time to get an apartment that was closer to campus. So in August of 2020, shortly after Carrie's 38th birthday, she, along with her two beloved cats, moved just 10 minutes away from Boston University into an old apartment building on a busy street. With her apartment still filled with unopened moving boxes and furniture wrapped in plastic, Carrie broke out her laptop and enthusiastically wrote an email to all of her students for the year titled "The Joy of Learning French." In it, her students saw her passion for the French language and how excited she was about the upcoming academic year. A few weeks later, on Monday, September 14th, Carrie was back at her apartment building after classes, and she had just purchased a brand new piece of furniture that she wanted to haul up to her apartment. This piece of furniture was not actually assembled. All the parts and the directions were inside of this box that was 7 feet tall, 1 foot wide, and weighed just under 80 pounds. And so Carrie got this huge box out of her car at street level and then hauled it all the way through the front doors of her apartment building into the first floor lobby, where she leaned it up against the wall and then pressed the call button for the elevator. To understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of how Carrie's elevator worked. Once the elevator car arrived on your floor, you would slide open this big door called the hoistway door. And on the other side, you would see the elevator car, and on the car itself would be yet another door. This door is called the car gate. This metal accordion-style door would also be slid to the side manually, but unlike the hoistway door, the car gate had to be shut all the way in order for the elevator to move between floors. So when the light dinged in the first floor lobby above Carrie's head, she opened up the hoistway door, and then she reached inside and slid open the car gate, and then she grabbed her package and began trying to push it inside of the elevator car. The only way it looked like she could fit this huge package inside of the elevator was if she got it in there at an angle standing up. But no matter how hard she pushed and pulled on it, she just could not get it to go inside. And so while Carrie's doing this, another tenant happened to walk in the front doors of the apartment building, and they saw Carrie struggling, and at first he just walked past Carrie and started going up the stairs towards his own apartment, but he stopped and he turned and he just said to Carrie, "Hey, I don't think it's a good idea to keep doing what you're doing. That package looks like it's too heavy to be on that elevator. The elevator's really old and you might trip a sensor and it might start moving before you're ready. You know, we've had problems with that elevator before. It's just not worth the risk." And so Carrie, who's already pretty committed to doing this, she hesitates for a second and just kind of looks at her package, and she looks up at the guy and says, "You know what, I'm just going to try one more time to get it inside the elevator." And so Carrie goes back to trying to get it on, and this other tenant hesitates for a second and then decides, okay, I'll help her do it. And so he goes down and he holds open the hoistway door with his hand, and Carrie goes inside of the elevator car and she uses her hip to keep open the car gate. And the two of them begin pushing and pulling, and finally they're able to wedge this package at an angle inside of the elevator car. And so Carrie thanks the guy and he says no problem. He turns and walks up the stairs and he disappears. Once he was gone, Carrie didn't press any of the floor buttons. Instead, she tried to close the car gate over the top of her package. But at the same time, a maintenance worker in the floor below her, which was the basement, hit the call button for the elevator. Unbeknownst to Carrie, the top of her huge package, when they wedged it inside, had pressed up against the sensor at the top of the door frame that registers when the car gate has shut. And so when the maintenance worker pressed the call button, because that package was pressing on the sensor, it tricked the elevator into thinking the gate was shut and secured, and now it was time to move. And so the car began to go down, but it only made it a couple of feet before the movement caused the package to slip off of the sensor, causing the elevator to stop. Carrie was most likely very confused how this car would have moved, considering the car gate was still wide open, but she had bigger problems. She was now trapped between the first floor lobby and the basement. But she didn't panic. Instead, she decided she would just get her package back inside the elevator car, and then she would figure out what to do next. The package, when it came off that sensor, had fallen forward and was basically jutting out of the elevator. So the top half of it was in the first floor lobby, propped up against the floor of the first floor lobby. And so Carrie turned around so her back was facing outside of the elevator, and she got down in a squatting position underneath her package, so her shoulder was up against the package, and then she began pressing it up as hard as she could until she managed to press the package back inside of the car. But again, the top of that package made contact with that sensor that registers whether that gate is shut, and so believing believing it was shut and secure, the elevator began moving down again. And this time, Carrie, whose back is to the opening of the elevator, she lost her balance and fell backwards out of the elevator into that narrow space between the outside of the elevator and the inside of the elevator shaft. Now, if the elevator had not been moving, she probably could have just crawled back up into the elevator, but unfortunately, her package this time did not slip off the sensor. And so the elevator still believed the gate was shut, and so it kept on moving down. And so as soon as Carrie fell into this narrow space, the movement of the elevator would have kind of sucked her up into that space, crushing her up against the inside of the elevator shaft wall as the car forces its way down past her towards the basement. But the car doesn't even get to the basement. It stops once Carrie is pinned perfectly between the elevator and the elevator shaft walls. When the fire department finally arrived, it was too late. Carrie was already deceased. Around 6 p.m. on December 10th, 2003, 45-year-old Susie Whamsley unpacked Christmas decorations at her home in the city of Mansfield, Texas, alternating between removing items from boxes and explaining what they were to her 3-year-old granddaughter. Christmas had always been a big deal to Susie, and so every year she went all out. Her 46-year-old husband, Rick, had hung the lights outside last night, and now it was time for her to tackle the interior. And it was extra important to get it done early this year because their neighbors were coming over for a holiday party in just a few days. The thought gave Susie a little twinge of anxiety, and so she twirled her red hair around her finger as she watched her granddaughter inspect an ornament. Just then, Susie heard a camera shutter, and she looked up to see Rick taking a picture of the moment. He winked and told her it was a good one, before plopping down on the couch and showing their granddaughter another ornament from the box. Susie smiled. She was so happy that Rick got to have these moments with their granddaughter. When their own kids had been young, Rick had worked a lot at his accounting job. This had allowed the family to live in a big house in an exclusive neighborhood, but it had also meant that Rick missed out on a lot. He'd spent long hours at the office while Susie stayed home with their kids, Sarah and Andrew. And so it was Susie who had gotten to go to all of Sarah's cheerleading pep rallies and take Andrew on fishing trips. But now that Rick worked from home and so had more time, it was his turn now with their granddaughter. Just then, Susie heard the door open and a voice call out. Seconds later, Sarah walked into the room. Sarah first gave her little girl a big hug, then she stood and greeted Susie and Rick. But right away, Susie noticed that Sarah looked worried. Susie asked her what was up, and Sarah sort of looked down and said sort of sheepishly that she'd gotten another bill. Susie knew that the bill Sarah must be referring to was a legal bill, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah was right in the middle of a custody battle with her ex-husband, Todd, and Susie and Rick were funding it. Which Susie was more than willing to do, because she knew Sarah was a great mom and they wanted to continue seeing their granddaughter as much as they could. But this whole mess was not the first time Sarah's problems had put a lot of stress on the family. Sarah used to be sort of a typical kid, she was an outgoing, bubbly cheerleader with lots of friends and just did typical teenage girl things. But then by the end of her teen years, she really began leaning into partying and also dating older men. At one point, towards the end of high school, Susie and Rick had even kicked her out of the house. But unfortunately, that had backfired because Sarah had moved in with her ex-husband, Todd, and gotten pregnant. And their relationship resulted in lots of mental health struggles for Sarah and also some substance abuse. But the whole family had still gotten through it, and now Sarah was 25 years old and doing much better. And they had their beautiful granddaughter. So Susie just swallowed down her own complicated feelings about Sarah's newest legal bill and just smiled at her daughter. She told her not to worry about it, she and her father would pay for it. Sarah was visibly relieved and thanked her mother and father. And then not long after that, the family decided to head out for dinner. And at that point, Susie dashed upstairs to let her other child, her 19-year-old son Andrew, know that they were leaving. Andrew still lived at home because he had been going to a community college nearby. However, when Susie got up to his room, she found it was empty. And Susie just shook her head, trying her best to suppress her bitter disappointment. But ultimately, she really wasn't surprised by his absence, because Andrew lately had been spending more and more time out of the house. Andrew had always been a pretty quiet kid, but lately he'd been getting so frustrated and mad so easily and basically fought with everybody in the family constantly. And then, just this past fall, Susie had found out that her son had secretly dropped out of community college, even though she and her husband had just bought him a car for having kept up his grades. And ever since, the mood in the house had been tense, to say the least. So Andrew, probably to get away from that tense feeling, had been spending more and more time out of the house with his girlfriend Chelsea. And so Susie figured that must be where he was now, out with Chelsea, which was sort of a bummer to Susie because he'd slipped out without saying anything to anyone, even though they had all talked about how after dinner that night, the family was going to decorate the Christmas tree, which was a family tradition, and it looked like he wouldn't be there. But there was nothing she could do, so Susie sighed, left the room, and headed downstairs. Hours later, the family was back at home after having dinner and after decorating the Christmas tree, and Rick and Susie were playing a board game with Sarah and their granddaughter. And they were having a nice time until Sarah finally stood up and announced that she was tired and needed to get her daughter off to bed. And just a few minutes after that, they had left the house, and suddenly the house felt really quiet. Susie looked around the room, which was now a Christmas wonderland after all the decorating they had done. They'd covered the stair banister and the fireplace mantle with wreaths, and the tree was all lit up and bright. There were even presents already under the tree, wrapped and ready for their kids and granddaughter. Susie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of brownies that she had taken out of the oven just a little bit ago. They were Andrew's favorite, but Andrew was not here. Susie asked Rick if he wanted a brownie, but he didn't answer. And when she looked up, she saw that Rick was starting to doze off on the couch. So she suggested that they both just go upstairs and go to bed. But hours later, Susie lay in bed, completely awake. She still had a million things on her mind, like other presents she still had to buy and the errand she had to run for the party with the neighbors that was coming up later that week. She tossed and turned a bit longer, but when she just could not sleep, she finally just got up and went downstairs, turned on the TV, and laid down on the couch. And sure enough, not long after laying down and suddenly being surrounded by the sparkle of Christmas lights, Susie felt tired and finally drifted off to sleep. Around 24 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. on December 11th, a 911 operator sat at their post in the Mansfield police station. They were nearing the end of their shift, so they were tired and bleary-eyed. But they snapped back into focus when a call came in. They picked it up and clearly announced themselves, but there was no answer from the caller. However, this wasn't really unusual to the operator. Calls like this are referred to as silent calls and are often an accident or a prank. But a caller who doesn't say anything could also be in danger and may be unable to speak. So the operator followed protocol and looked up the phone number the call was being made from and was able to get an address, 820 Turnberry Drive, Mansfield, Texas. And as soon as the operator had that location, they sent a message to the officers on duty requesting that somebody go to the scene and just make sure everything was okay. Just 4 minutes later, 3 officers pulled up to 820 Turnberry Drive. And they didn't need to do much investigating to see that they were clearly in a wealthy part of town. This was an exclusive neighborhood called Walnut Estates, and the street was lined with all these big, beautiful houses. And number 820 was no exception. It was a sprawling 2-story brick home that was clearly getting a jump on Christmas because it was already covered in holiday lights. However, those lights were currently off, and the house was dark. It was close to midnight, so the officers guessed the homeowners must have accidentally dialed the emergency line and not known it, and then gone to sleep, not realizing what they had done. Regardless, the officers got out of their cruiser and went to the front door to knock and ring the doorbell. And when nobody answered, they went around the side of the house and began to look in the windows, but they couldn't see much, and they also couldn't hear any movement coming from inside. And this did put them a bit on edge, because somebody had to have been home in order to call 911 a few minutes ago, and whoever it was, even if it was by mistake, now wasn't answering. So the officers decided they did need to get inside this house, because now they were thinking, it was possible that somebody could be injured and maybe unable to respond. When they tried the front door, they found it was locked, so they walked around to look for a way in, and they saw the attached garage door was open. So they opened it up, stepped inside, and called out. Nobody answered, so they kept walking into the house. And as they kept walking into the house, they began to hear this low-pitched electronic droning sound. The officers shined their flashlights through the dark and followed the sound into the kitchen. And there, on the counter, was the source of that droning sound. It was the receiver of a landline phone that had been left off its hook. At this point, the officers drew their weapons. They didn't know what was going on, but it felt suspicious enough that they should be on guard. As they made their way out of the kitchen, they moved quickly and quietly, because they really weren't sure what was waiting for them in the rest of the house. But even with their guards up, they were not ready for the scene they stumbled onto in the living room. At first glance, even in the dark, it was clear this room was destroyed.
And then as their eyes began to adjust, they saw the room was also covered with blood. There were huge pools of it soaked through the carpet in front of the fireplace, and lamps and furniture had been overturned and spattered with more blood. And then one of the police officer's flashlight beams landed on the couch. And there, under a blanket that was also soaked with blood, was the body of a woman. For a second, none of the officers said anything. Then, another officer shined his flashlight around the room in a slow circle until the light fell on the body of a man, lying face down only a few feet away. 2 victims, both almost certainly dead. The officers called for backup. Not long after that backup call went out, the detective on call for the Mansfield Police Department, Ralph Standifer, stood in the front yard of 820 Turnberry Drive, staring up at the home. All the lights were on inside, and uniformed officers had pulled crime scene tape around the perimeter. Outside, flashing police and ambulance lights lit up the street as crime scene techs geared up to begin their job. Standifer rubbed his eyes. He'd been with the department for almost 20 years, but it was still hard to get used to being woken up from a deep sleep by his pager. He was there with another detective, Mark Kelly. They'd already been briefed on the situation. The home was owned by a couple in their 40s named Rick and Susie Whamsley, and they both appeared to have been shot to death. Now, Standifer hadn't even stepped foot in the house yet, but he already knew there was a lot about this case that didn't make sense. Officers had gone to the scene because of a 911 call that came in less than an hour ago, but it didn't seem like Rick or Susie had made that call. Judging by the state of their bodies, they'd been dead for a lot longer than that. Standifer assumed, this meant that the killer must have made the 911 call, either because they lingered in the home after killing them and then made the call, or they left the scene and then returned at some point to make that 911 call. Standifer knew that, it was possible that somebody else, who was not the killer, could have anonymously made the call after discovering the bodies, but that felt far-fetched. Like, why would that person not stay and at least give more information to police? And so Standifer was hoping that once he got inside and looked around, things would make more sense. Standifer and Kelly walked up to the home and pulled plastic booties over their shoes before entering. Once inside, they split up. Kelly went through each room taking video, while Standifer just did a walkthrough of the entire crime scene. Standifer first stopped to examine the front door, and he didn't see anything that indicated it had been forced open. And as he walked through the home, he didn't notice any other doors or windows that showed evidence of forced entry either. However, that was where the killer's smoothness ended. The whole scene was an incredible mess. There was a ton of bloody shoe prints all over the place. There were some bloody fingerprints on the wallpaper in the dining room. There was a knife blade that was missing its handle on the carpet. And then, of course, there was the living room, where it looked like an intense, bloody, horrible fight had taken place. In addition to the overturned furniture, there was also a lot of blood splatter and splotches that indicated whoever was bleeding had fallen multiple times. But despite the mess, there wasn't anything obviously missing. The TV was still there were still wrapped presents under the tree, and there weren't any open drawers or closets, which you would have expected if somebody was here looking for something to steal. So Standifer did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He turned to look at the couch where the woman still lay under the blanket. This was Susie Whamsley. She'd been shot in the head, but her blanket had been pulled up and her expression was almost peaceful, which suggested she might have died while she was still asleep. But this didn't track with the rest of her wounds, because whoever had shot her had apparently also stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and torso. It was clear she hadn't struggled though, which suggested she likely was the first one shot. But that meant the killer stabbed her after she was already dead. It was unusual for a killer to use multiple weapons like that, but it also lined up with the rest of the very chaotic crime scene. Whoever did this was clearly frenzied and highly emotional. Standifer frowned and moved away from Susie towards his other victim, her husband, Rick Whamsley. Rick's body was shirtless, so right away, Standifer saw that he too had been attacked with multiple weapons. He was covered in slashing wounds, and he'd been shot at least once in the head. But unlike Susie, it was clear to Standifer that Rick had fought with his killer. Rick's fist was clenched tightly, and Standifer saw there were actually a few pieces of hair wrapped around Rick's fingers. And so Standifer put on some gloves, and then he knelt down and he opened up Rick's hand to find strands of dark, long hair inside of his palm. And next to Rick's hand on the carpet was a broken blue hair clip. Standifer knew this could be something major, because at least at first glance, it appeared like in Rick's final moments of life, he had managed to grab the hair of his killer and rip some of it out. And this was incredibly lucky, because it meant they would now have an actual piece of forensic evidence, this hair, to test against any suspects that they had. But the evidence was also kind of confusing, because the long hair and the feminine-looking clip suggested that Rick had been fighting with a woman. But physically, that just didn't make much sense. Rick was a big guy. He was at least 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, and so Standifer had a hard time imagining a typical woman alone being able to overpower him. Even a strong man might have had trouble dealing with Rick, given Rick's size. So now, as Standifer stood there looking at the hair and the blue clip, he started to wonder if, maybe there wasn't just one killer here. Maybe there were multiple killers, and that's how Rick had been overpowered. Standifer went to go find Detective Kelly. Whether it was one killer or multiple, it was clear the level of brutality at this crime scene suggested there had to have been a personal motive. And so the detectives needed to start making a list of everyone the Whamsleys were close to. It was almost 8 a.m. the following morning by the time Standifer was done at the scene. When he left the house, he saw that beyond the yellow crime scene tape, there was a crowd of neighbors and news trucks gathered to see what was going on at the Whamsleys. As Standifer walked to his patrol car, a deputy approached him and told him they'd been talking to some of these neighbors and they had some information. One person said they heard multiple gunshots around 3 a.m. yesterday morning, which was 21 hours before the 911 call came in. And another said that last night around 9 p.m., they noticed the Whamsleys had not turned on their Christmas lights, which was unusual for them. Standifer ran through this timeline in his head. If it was true that there were gunshots at 3 a.m. on December 11th, and then by 9 p.m. later that same day, the house was uncharacteristically dark and the Christmas lights were not on, well, the reason for that could be because by that time, the Whamsleys were already dead. The 911 call had come about 2.5 hours after that neighbor had noticed the Christmas lights were not on in the house. But somebody was in that house who made the 911 call, and based on this timeline, it seemed it could not have been Rick or Susie because they were dead by the time the 911 call happened. So who was in the house making that call? Standifer asked the deputies if there was anything else, and they said, yeah, there was. The neighbors had also told them that the Whamsleys had 2 adult children, Sarah and Andrew. Sarah lived in her own apartment, and the deputies had already contacted her. She was on her way to the station. But Andrew still lived with his parents, and the deputies, so far, had not been able to reach him. At this, Standifer felt himself immediately tense up. Both the Whamsleys' children needed to be looked at as suspects. It was highly likely that with the parents both dead, the kids would inherit money, and probably a lot of it, judging from the very upscale neighborhood where their parents lived. And the fact that Andrew lived with his parents, but wasn't at home and was currently unreachable, made him the much more suspicious of the 2 siblings. But just then, Standifer heard somebody yelling. He looked up to see a dark-haired young man getting out of the driver's side of a Ford Mustang. He was gesturing wildly to a police officer who had stopped the car, pointing to the home, the crime scene, and saying that that was his house. A young woman got out of the passenger side of the vehicle, and Standifer could see she and this young man both looked totally panicked. The detective hustled over to the car and asked the young man what his name was, although he was already pretty sure he knew. It was, in fact, Andrew Whamsley. Andrew told them that he and his girlfriend, the woman he was with, had seen a news report about 2 bodies in this neighborhood being found, and he had driven here to make sure it was not his mother and father. As he said this, Standifer's eyes immediately went to the girlfriend's hair, hoping it was dark brown, like the hair he had found inside of Rick's fist. But it was blonde. Standifer was momentarily disappointed, but he knew that the girlfriend's hair color didn't actually prove or disprove anything about Andrew himself. And so Standifer looked around at the news cameras and the crowd and decided he would wait to give Andrew any details about what had happened. And so he just told the young couple to come with him back to the station where he would explain everything. A short time later, Standifer sat across the table from Andrew inside of an interview room, watching the young man fall apart as he learned his parents were both dead. Andrew looked down at the ground as Standifer broke the news, unable to speak as tears streamed down his cheeks. Standifer waited for Andrew to calm down a little bit, but he didn't really calm down at all, and so Standifer just began asking basic questions because it seemed like Andrew was not going to be capable of giving anything more than short, simple answers. He said that he lived with his parents, but stayed at his girlfriend, Chelsea's, most of the time. And during the period of time that police believed the couple was murdered, Andrew said that he and Chelsea played some miniature golf, they went to the movies, and then they went to a friend's house for most of the night before heading back to Chelsea's to sleep. After that, Andrew went quiet again, staring hard at the floor as his eyes welled up with more tears. To Standifer, Andrew's emotional reaction to this news seemed pretty sincere. And when Standifer looked over Andrew's hands and forearms, looking for any of the telltale cuts or bruises the killer almost certainly would have picked up while fighting with Rick, he only saw one small, shallow scratch on his hand, which realistically, Andrew could have gotten anywhere. But his emotional reaction and the lack of cuts and bruises on his body was not enough to rule Andrew out, especially if he was potentially working with somebody else. And so Standifer decided to push him a little bit, just to see how he reacted. He told Andrew that he was going to send some officers to check his car for blood, and he was also going to get Andrew's fingerprints. Then he also said he was going to have to confirm his alibi with his girlfriend and friends, and he was going to check his bank records, looking specifically for large payments that could suggest a paid hit. After that, Standifer just stood there, waiting for Andrew to get defensive or angry. But Andrew just nodded and said that all sounded fine. And so when Standifer stepped out of the interview room, he was not feeling too optimistic about Andrew as a suspect. And so when his partner, Detective Kelly, came around the corner and said Andrew's sister, Sarah, was in an interview room ready to be spoken to, Standifer was glad to hear it. The first thing Standifer noticed when he went into Sarah's interrogation room was that Sarah had long, dark hair, which was roughly the same color as the strands he had seen in Rick's hand. Now, he didn't let his excitement show. Instead, he just sat down at the table and simply asked Sarah what she had been doing on December 10th. Like her brother, Sarah was visibly devastated. But unlike Andrew, who had been barely able to talk, Sarah seemed almost like she was impatient with Standifer's questions. She rattled off her actions on the night of her parents' murder so quickly that Standifer could barely keep up with her. She said that she had gone to her parents' house around 6 p.m., and they had all gone out to dinner. They had all briefly come back to the parents' house after, and then Sarah took her daughter and went home for the night. And Sarah seemed like she might just keep on rambling, but Standifer stopped her and just said, "Look, do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents?" And at this, Sarah's eyes widened, and she nodded furiously, like she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward and blurted out that this was exactly what she wanted to tell him. Because 1 month ago, according to Sarah, somebody had tried to kill her and her parents. She said it happened in November. They had been driving on the highway when out of nowhere, they heard this loud banging sound. Worried it could be something to do with the car, they pulled over into a parking lot to see what had happened. That's when they found a distinct bullet hole in the rear of their car, near their gas tank. Sarah said they had reported this to police, but despite looking into it, the police never found a suspect. However, Sarah told Standifer that she always suspected her ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, was the shooter. She told the detective that she and Todd were in a custody battle over their daughter, which her parents were paying for. Todd was furious about it. Standifer sat back in his seat, trying to keep his face neutral, but he felt like a bomb had just been dropped in the middle of his case. The Whamsleys had been shot at twice over a 30-day period. Whoever had killed them was brazen and determined. The detective leaned back and folded his arms as he tried to work out what all this meant to him. On one hand, Sarah had been in the car during that first shooting, which made it very unlikely, but not impossible, that she was involved in that attempt. But she also had no real alibi for the night of her parents' murder, and had admitted she was in desperate need of money. She was also eager to talk, maybe too eager, and she had pointed the finger right at her ex, which could mean she was trying to distract Standifer from looking at her. Or it could mean she was scared, and that Todd Cleveland was the shooter and he was guilty. Luckily though, Standifer didn't have to make any decisions about her guilt or innocence on her demeanor alone. He had those strands of hair from the crime scene. So he told Sarah they would need a DNA sample from her. And Standifer had half expected her to protest, but instead, she agreed immediately. As Standifer left to get one of the evidence techs, he felt more confused than ever. Sarah had seemed like a promising suspect, But her willingness to provide DNA told Standifer she likely did not have much to hide. Standifer suddenly felt the weight of how tired he was. He'd been awake all night, and his exhaustion was making it hard to unravel this case that seemed to get murkier with every clue. The next day was December 13th. It had been 2 days since Rick and Susie Whamsley's bodies had been found, and detectives Ralph Standifer and Mark Kelly were standing around a desk at the Mansfield, Texas Police Precinct. They were going over photos, financial documents, witness statements, and the newly released autopsy results, which just confirmed a lot of what they already knew, that both Rick and Susie had been shot and stabbed, and that Rick had fought back very hard. Standifer was more sure than ever that this was a personal crime. So he and Kelly were going over all of the evidence they had on their two key suspects, the children, Sarah and Andrew Whamsley. In the last couple of days, they had learned a lot more about the Whamsleys and their children. Standifer had been right. The parents had a big estate that their kids were set to inherit. It was worth over $1.5 million. And Rick also had a large life insurance policy as well. And so this gave the siblings a very strong financial motivation for killing their parents. But all Standifer could come up with to this point was evidence that actually ruled both the kids out. They had taken Sarah Whamsley's DNA when they interviewed her, and it was not a match for the hair found at the scene, which didn't mean she wasn't somehow involved, but it meant the only real evidence Standifer had against her was her financial motive and a lack of an alibi. As for Andrew, his alibi checked out. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, confirmed his story. The detectives had also contacted one of his friends, a guy named Jeremy Lavender, and he confirmed that Andrew and Chelsea were with him the night Andrew's parents were killed. Plus, Andrew's fingerprints didn't match the bloody ones that were found at the crime scene. There had also been a preliminary search of Andrew's car, and they hadn't seen any obvious blood yet, although the evidence texts were not quite finished. So, Standifer and Kelly were at the point in this case where they needed to seriously consider other suspects. And luckily, they already had somebody at the top of their list. Sarah had been sure that her ex-husband Todd was responsible for the attack on the Whamsleys that happened a month ago. Standifer had already reached out to the police of the town where the Whamsleys were shot at, and luckily, the officers there had extracted the bullet from their car door. And after testing that bullet, it showed that bullet came from the same gun that was later used to kill the Whamsleys. So, if Todd was a suspect for that attack, well, then by almost default, he had to be a suspect for the murders. So, Standifer grabbed his keys off his desk and flagged Kelly to come with him. It was time to go see Todd Cleveland. When the detectives sat down with Todd at his home, he seemed extremely agitated and sort of rattled. He said he had just heard about the murders, and he was totally stunned. He also said he knew this looked bad for him, but he was adamant he was not involved. He may have been at war with Sarah and Susie, but he liked Rick, and besides, he wasn't around the night of the 10th because he was working. He was a plumber, and he said he had a few emergency jobs that night and in the early morning too. Standifer and Kelly stayed for a bit longer, but they didn't get much more out of Todd. So eventually they left and headed back to the station, and right away they called Todd's plumbing clients to confirm his alibi. And sure enough, it all checked out. Once again, the detectives were back to square one. The following day, Standifer and Kelly drove out to the home of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea. They weren't there because they thought Chelsea was a suspect. Her blonde hair had pretty much ruled her out. But the detectives had decided that since they were already starting over, they may as well begin by reevaluating their first two suspects, the Whamsley's children, Andrew and Sarah. Neither sibling appeared to have been at the crime scene, but Standifer and Kelly wanted to learn more about who they were close to. Specifically, who in their lives they might have trusted enough to help them plan or even carry out a murder. When the detectives arrived at Chelsea's mother's house, where Chelsea lived, they knocked on the door, and Chelsea opened it up. And quickly, she invited the detectives inside. And as soon as they stepped in, Standifer just froze, because the house was truly a mess. Not just in disarray, but disgusting. There was trash everywhere and grime on everything. I mean, it really looked deeply dirty and uncared for. The two detectives just looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. Over on the couch was another young woman who looked to be about Chelsea's age. When she saw the detectives, she stood up, walked over, and introduced herself as Chelsea's friend, Susanna. And over the course of their brief conversation, she told them that she had actually been staying in this house with Chelsea for quite a while. After that, Standifer asked Susanna to please give them some privacy, and she nodded and disappeared into a bedroom. At this point, Standifer sat down with Chelsea and began asking her a couple questions about the days around the murders, while his partner, Kelly, began to pace around the house. Chelsea had already confirmed Andrew's alibi once, but she seemed perfectly willing to go through it again, and nothing about her story changed. And Standifer was just wrapping things up when he heard Kelly gasp in the next room. When Kelly reappeared in the living room, he looked visibly shaken, but he said he was fine. The detectives left shortly after that, and when they got back in the car, Kelly explained why he had reacted like that in the other room. He said he had been looking through all the kitchen drawers because there had been a knife blade at the murder scene, and he wanted to see if its matching handle that was missing was in Chelsea's kitchen. But at some point when he opened up a drawer, a whole bunch of roaches crawled out. That's why he gasped. Standifer grimaced. But also, the thought of those roaches made something else click into place that had been bothering him the whole time they were at Chelsea's. He was thinking it seemed very likely somebody living in a place like that, living truly in squalor, might be eager for some money. And so as they drove back to the station, Standifer decided he needed to widen the range of people he was asking for DNA from. It clearly was not enough to get DNA just from Andrew and Sarah. That really had gone nowhere. What they needed to do was also get DNA samples from all of their friends as well. It would take almost a month to collect all the DNA samples they requested, and then the detectives had to wait another 2 months just to get the results back, which arrived on March 30th. And when the results did arrive, Standifer just sat at his desk, staring at the results in shock. Because now he realized that a major piece of the puzzle had been right in front of him the entire time. Based on these DNA results, the investigation, and also a confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Rick and Susie Whamsley in the early morning hours of December 11th, 2003. Just before 3 a.m. on December 11th, the killer stood outside of 820 Turnberry Drive, watching Rick and Susie's garage door slowly rise. As they waited for it to open all the way, they felt both dread and also a sense of nervous anticipation. They had been talking about killing Susie and Rick for months, and actually, they had already tried to do it once before. But now, if everything went according to plan, it was actually going to happen. Once the door was fully open, the killer slipped inside, and as they entered, they could hear the sound of footsteps right behind them, their two accomplices. All three very quietly began to creep through the home. And as they passed through the kitchen, two of them grabbed knives. They already had a gun with them, but they figured it didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible. The house was completely silent. It was obvious both Rick and Susie were asleep. The killer was eager to get started, because in their mind, Rick and Susie had more money and a better life than they deserved, and it just was not fair. The killer had nothing, and so killing Rick and Susie would not only feel good, but it would be the answer to all of their problems. On the other side of what they did this night was going to be a much better life. And so with the gun in hand, the killer walked down the hallway to the living room where they found Susie, asleep on the couch under a blanket. And the killer, as soon as they were standing over her, raised their gun, aimed it at Susie's head, and fired a shot. And immediately, the killer then hurried upstairs to the bedroom where Rick was, and they shot at him too. Except this time, their aim was off. Their bullets hit the doorway outside the bedroom, and as Rick jolted up, the killer fired again. This shot hit Rick in the temple, but Rick didn't fall. Instead, to the killer's horror, he ran at the killer and began to fight them. The killer struggled with Rick, and before they knew it, they both were in the living room where Rick managed to force the killer to drop the gun. At this point, one of the two accomplices tried to get Rick off the killer, but while Rick was being pulled away, he managed to grab the killer's hair and ripped some of their hair out of their head, along with their hair clip. When Rick then tried to turn and run for the front door, the other accomplice grabbed the gun from the ground and shot Rick in the back, which caused him to finally collapse. But he still wasn't dead, and he looked up at the killer and the accomplices to ask why they were doing this. But the three of them just stared at Rick in shock. They hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to kill someone. And so now they were actually wondering if just shooting Susie once was actually enough to kill her. And so instead of talking to Rick, the killer and one of the accomplices began simultaneously stabbing Rick and Susie over and over again until they both were for sure dead. The trio then fled the home, and the primary killer spent the rest of the night totally excited about the good fortune that would almost certainly befall them once the bodies were discovered. But after that whole day passed, the next 20 or so hours passed, there still had been no indication that anybody knew Rick and Susie were dead. And this was a problem for the killer and their accomplices, because the sooner the bodies were found, the sooner they would get access to the money that they had killed for. So, just before midnight, they returned to the crime scene, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. Then, without saying anything, they placed the phone receiver on the counter and fled the house for a second time. When Detective Standifer got the DNA test results back from the hair that had been found at the crime scene, it told him exactly who had attacked Rick. But the hair didn't actually match any of his suspects. It belonged to someone that they actually hadn't even interviewed. The hair was a match for Susanna Toldano, the same Susanna who was a friend of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea, who was present at her house the day they went to go re-interview her. It would turn out Susanna was the one who had fired at Rick and Susie's car back in November. And on the night of the actual murders, it was Susanna who shot Susie and fought Rick. She was the primary killer. Susanna did this because she needed money, and she had actually been promised a large chunk of it by her accomplices, Andrew and Chelsea. It was Andrew and Chelsea's idea to murder Susie and Rick. Andrew was furious with his parents because they had cut him off financially after they found out he'd secretly dropped out of college. He was also in love with Chelsea, who didn't have a lot of money, and she lived with a single mother who had to work multiple jobs to barely keep their family afloat. And so the plan was made to murder the parents for money. But it was ultimately Susanna who pulled the trigger. Susanna, Chelsea, and Andrew were all convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. As for Sarah, she had nothing to do with the murders, and she has never healed from the loss of her parents.
On February 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside, and when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property, and as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left, and it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force, and suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe, and as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't. And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw 2 human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the 2 police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there, he was deceased, his body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around, and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there was some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building, and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escapes. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people, they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this, do not climb on top of this factory, it's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof, they're all super excited, and the game has begun. It's 2:30, and as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted, and there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below, and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game, they're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos. And Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick, smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall, they're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, Fahrenheit. The outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked and shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton, all the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea, and in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office, like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence, and he basically just told the police, "You gotta get here now." And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse, and below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1960, a 15-year-old girl named Mela Bjorklund climbed off the back of her boyfriend's motorcycle. Her boyfriend was an 18-year-old named Nils Gustafsson, and this couple had just driven 18 miles from the city in southern Finland where they lived to get to this beautiful forest and lake where they, along with another couple, were going to go camping. The other couple, who was still a few minutes behind them, was Nils's best friend, Seppo, and his girlfriend, whose name was Anja. As Nils parked his motorcycle, Mela looked out over the lake, and she saw it was totally beautiful, the forest completely wrapped around the lake, and there were all these people out on the lake boating and swimming and having a great time. But despite all these people here, to Mela, it still kind of felt very quiet and peaceful. This didn't feel like a big touristy destination. It really felt like they were out in the wild. And for Mela, who loved the outdoors, this felt like a great spot to celebrate her 16th birthday, because that's actually why the couples were out camping. Mela was turning 16 in a couple of days, and so this was going to be her party. Just then, Mela heard another motorcycle approaching, and she turned around and she saw it was the other couple. It was Seppo who was driving, and Anja was right behind him. And Seppo, he looked up and saw Mela looking at him, and he grinned and braked hard with his motorcycle and kind of swung the back wheel out like he was in an action movie. And And Mela thought it was totally funny and she started laughing, and that's when Nils turned around and he saw his girlfriend laughing heartily at Seppo. A moment later, all four friends were giving each other hugs and saying hello, and then after catching up, the friends walked over to this small shack that was right by the water. It was the snack kiosk. Their plan was to load up on supplies and then quickly make their way into the forest where they'd actually be camping and just relax, enjoy the night, and go to bed. But as the friends walked towards the snack kiosk, Seppo made a joke about how his motorcycle was way better than Nils's motorcycle. And Mela, who was Nils's boyfriend, she laughed at this joke and thought it was really funny. But as she was laughing, she happened to look over at Nils, her own boyfriend, and she could tell, he just looked upset, like he was scowling at her and also at Seppo. And immediately, Mela felt really bad because she was thinking, maybe Nils thinks I'm flirting with Seppo by laughing at all of his jokes. And so Mela really did not want Nils to think anything was going on with her and Seppo because there was nothing going on. But when Mela looked over at Nils again to kind of confirm that he really did look mad, he didn't look mad. He was smiling and laughing again. And so Mela told herself, she must have just imagined that Nils was never upset. It was all in her head. So Mela reached over and grabbed Nils's hand, and the two couples walked the rest of the way over to the kiosk. The snack kiosk was really just this little shack right near the beach, and then behind the shack was a small house where the owners of the snack kiosk lived. And as soon as they got up to the kiosk, Mela noticed the woman who was manning the kiosk had her back to them and didn't seem remotely interested in turning around and helping them get what they needed. And so Mela was just like, okay, hey, excuse me, we just want to buy something. And the woman at this point, she whipped her head around and she looked at Mela really angrily and just said, "What do you want?" And Mela, who was totally taken aback by this, she kind of mumbled an apology, not really even sure if she did something wrong or not. And then she asked the woman if they could just get a couple of beers and sodas and they'd be on their way. And as this is happening, Seppo and Anja, who were right behind Mela, they were just giggling the whole time because this woman's behavior was so bizarre and so unexpected, they just couldn't help themselves. So as the teenagers are giggling, this woman is bending down and getting the sodas and beer, and she's huffing really angrily like this is such a huge inconvenience, and then she just slammed them up on the counter. As the woman was punching in the total into the cash register, Mela found herself looking over at the house behind the shack where this woman presumably lived, and Mela noticed there were all these empty beer bottles that lined the front railing of the house. And so Mela figured, maybe this was a clue as to why this woman was so hostile. Any household that produced that many empty beer cans likely was not a very happy place to live. And so finally, the woman in the kiosk gave the teenagers their total, at which point Nils stepped forward and he actually paid for the stuff instead of Mela. And then as Nils and Mela grabbed the things they bought and were about to turn and leave, the woman in the kiosk kind of cleared her voice and she asked them, hey, are you camping out by the lake? And to Mela, it seemed like this woman was suddenly being really nice, maybe as a way to kind of make up for how rude she was when they first walked over. And so Mela put on a smile and told this woman that, yeah, we're staying out by the lake. We're really excited about it. Thanks for asking. But the woman did not seem happy to hear this. Instead, the woman kind of scowled and then told them that they better set their tent as far away from here as possible. None of the teenagers had any idea how to respond to this. So they just kind of stood there and there was this really intense, awkward silence for a moment. And then the kiosk lady just began literally shooing the teenagers away, telling them to go, get out of here. And so finally the teenagers did turn around and started walking. But after walking pretty far away from the kiosk, they heard the kiosk woman yell out at them one more time. She basically yelled at them that her and her family had already had lots of trouble with wild teenagers in the past camping out around this lake. And so now she and her husband were totally sick of it. And so after the kiosk lady yelled out this final comment, Seppo and Nils and Anja, they just started laughing because it just seemed so absurd how disrespectful and awful this woman was being, to the point where it was comical. But Mela, she didn't think it was funny. She seemed mean and very angry, and it totally freaked Mela out. But just a couple of minutes later, the teens were back at their motorcycles, and Nils and Mela hopped on one, and Seppo and Anja hopped on the other, and then they began driving down this wooded path that would take them to their campsite. The ride to their campsite was a very short one, and where they were positioned was on this piece of land that sort of jutted out onto the lake. It was very heavily forested, and so it's this amazing view of the water, but it's very secluded in the trees. And so right away, Nils and Seppo, they parked their motorcycles up against the trees, they pulled out a simple canvas tent, and they strung it up between two birch trees, and then with their campsite all set up, they grabbed some beers, and the friends began to drink. And it didn't take long before Mela had totally forgotten about the kiosk woman and how awful she had been. After all, Mela had really been looking forward to this trip, and now she was here at the campsite, relaxing with her friends. I mean, this was great. Also, Mela was really excited about her relationship with Nils. It was a relatively new one, and it was obvious that, for once, her boyfriend was somebody who liked her as much as she liked him. And also, Nils was very handsome, and he was popular, and he had this dark brown hair that he combed straight up, and he always wore this leather jacket everywhere. And so Mela just really liked being around him. He was super cool and made her feel really grown up. After sitting around for about 30 minutes to an hour, just having a couple of drinks and swapping stories and kind of easing into their night, the friends eventually made their way down to the water, and they went swimming for a while, and they continued to drink down by the dock. And then when they were tired of swimming, the teens just laid on the dock and enjoyed looking out at the sunset. Even though actually in Finland at this time of the year, it's not really a sunset because the sun does not actually fully set. And so when this happens, these are known as white nights, which are very beautiful. I mean, it's kind of like this hazy glow in the sky from the sun not quite setting. And so on this night, the teens are out there on the dock. They had this beautiful, white night to look up at. And for Mela, she felt like this was the perfect birthday celebration. In fact, she would jot down in her diary later that night just how amazing everything was going and how much fun she was having with Nils and their friends. Finally, the teens were done down by the dock, so they grabbed their things, they went back up to the campsite, they dried off, they changed, and then all four of them piled into their one little tent to go to sleep. And eventually, all four of them would drift off to sleep, but then at some point in the middle of the night, Mela woke up. And she heard rustling sounds outside the tent, and so she wondered if, maybe one of the friends had gotten up, and so she sat up and looked out the tent, and she couldn't see anything. She just saw the kind of hazy night sky from the white night, and she couldn't really tell if everybody was inside the tent or not. But then suddenly, a dark, shadowy figure moved in front of the tent flap, the open tent flap. And so this shadowy figure totally blocked all the light that was coming into the tent from the white night. And then this shadowy figure looked into the tent, and they had these bright, glowing red eyes. And before Mela or anybody else in the tent could do anything, there was a snapping sound, and the tent fell down on top of them. The next morning at 6 a.m., two boys who were not in any way connected to these four teenagers were at this lake. They were over to the side doing some fishing, and they were looking kind of out generally in the direction of where the four teenagers had stayed the night before. And this particular day, the lake was not remotely crowded like it was the day before. Basically, it was a ghost town. And suddenly they saw emerge from the forest, basically where the teens had camped, was this young man with blonde hair who was just running away from where that campsite was. And so these boys just stared for a second at this random guy with blonde hair running away from the campsite until the boys lost interest and just went back to fishing. As the morning wore on, more and more people came to the lake, but nobody made their way out to the campsite where the teenagers had been the night before. That is, until a father and his two sons decided to head out that way to go to that dock to go swimming. And so this father and his sons began walking on the same wooded trail that Nils and Seppo had driven their motorcycles on to get out to that camping site. And he eventually makes it to the clearing in the forest where this campsite was. And right away, he spots what looks like a crumpled heap of canvas kind of sitting between two trees. And he couldn't really tell what it was. And so the father walked a little bit closer to investigate. And eventually he realized what they were actually walking up on, at which point he threw up a hand to stop his sons from going any closer, and he turned around and he told his kids, "We have to leave right now." And so the father and his sons, they run back up that trail, they find a phone, and they call the police. When the police arrived at the lake just before noon, they would walk out to that campsite and they would see that crumpled heap of canvas, and then also in and around that crumpled heap were the four bodies of the four teenagers who had stayed there the night before. Anja and Seppo had not even made it out of the tent. They had been beaten and stabbed to death basically through the canvas fabric. Mela did manage to get out of the tent. However, she did not escape. She was kind of laying on top of the tent, and she had broken bones, and it would turn out she was stabbed a total of 15 times, and some of those stabs came when she was alive, and some came when she was dead. And then laying next to her was the body of her boyfriend Nils, and he was basically unrecognizable. His head had been beaten to a pulp. As officers descended on the scene and began rifling through the teenagers' backpacks and different belongings, one officer knelt down near all the victims to look more closely at each of their injuries. And as they were looking at each of the victims, they suddenly heard this gasping sound. It was very faint, but they could definitely hear it. And to their shock, Nils, so Mela's boyfriend, he suddenly opened his eyes and he looked up at this officer. He was still alive. And this officer who's seeing this, who was totally convinced Nils was dead, as everybody else was at first unsure what to even do, but then a second later, the officer stood up and began screaming for a medic. After Nils was taken away in an ambulance, the different investigative teams that had descended on the scene began going over the evidence and different things they had found, and pretty quickly, the general feel amongst all the investigators was this crime scene does not make any sense. There were some things missing from the crime scene that seemed to indicate this could have been a robbery, like missing wallets and missing watches. But there were other things that were missing that just didn't really make any sense to have been taken. Like, for example, the 2 motorcycles that the boys drove in, they were still there, parked up against the tree, but their keys were gone. So why steal the keys and not take the motorcycles? And then also, Nils's prized leather jacket and his shoes were also missing. These were not particularly valuable. I mean, they might have been emotionally valuable to Nils, but they certainly were not valuable enough to warrant a robber, killing people to get their hands on them. So eventually, the police actually called in the military to come into the forest and help with the search. And when the military arrived and began fanning out all around this huge forest, they would make a really big discovery. They would find Nils's shoes. And these shoes were speckled with blood. And it was clear from the bloody tracks nearby that the killer must have, at some point, put these shoes on at the campsite and then walked away while still wearing them, and then ultimately, ditched them 500 meters away underneath that pile of leaves. In the days after the murders, the police chased down dozens of leads all over Finland, but none of them amounted to anything. Nils would actually survive the attack, but his face was so badly damaged with so many broken bones in his head that it took a really long time before he could even speak. But when he finally could, and the police were able to interview him, it became immediately clear that Nils did not have a good memory of the attack. And in fact, the day of the attack, basically the whole day, he didn't really remember it. However, Nils would remember one thing. He said during the chaos of the actual attack, he distinctly remembered seeing a dark, shadowy figure with these bright red, glowing eyes. But the police couldn't just go out and look for a dark figure with red eyes, and so instead they just made a note of this and continued their investigation. The only real lead the police got were from those 2 boys who were fishing out on the lake a day after the murders happened, where they saw that guy with blonde hair running away from where the teens had camped. Now, these 2 boys didn't know the significance of what they were seeing, but obviously when the news broke about the murders, they recalled seeing that guy right in the area where they now knew, that's where the murders had happened. And so the police created a composite sketch of, what the boys thought they saw, this blonde guy running, and they would send this sketch all over Finland, and they would ask people, to come forward if you've seen this guy. And loads of people immediately came forward and said, yep, I've seen that guy. But it would turn out the police were getting loads of false reports because the sketch looked like lots of men in Finland. So this was not a unique enough sketch, basically. However, there was one tip that came into police that did really stand out. The day after the murders happened, a man named Hans Osman checked into a hospital located about 13 miles away from where the lake was, where the murders happened. And this guy Hans, when he checks into the hospital, he starts complaining of having these really intense stomach pains. But the doctors don't believe him because Hans actually just appears to be very drunk and very aggressive. First of all, he looked exactly like the police composite sketch of the blonde running guy. Like he was that guy. And also, Hans was filthy. He was covered in dirt and mud, and there was all this dirt kind of embedded in his fingernails like he had been digging with his hands. And he also had all these red stains all over his clothes that he refused to explain. And so eventually, one of the doctors called the police, and when the police interviewed Hans, they would discover that he had a history of violence, and he also said he used to be a member of the Nazi Party, and he also was a member of the Russian secret police, and all of this just seemed like a lie, but basically he seemed like a very erratic and unstable person. But Hans had a rock-solid alibi. On the night of the murder, Hans was located in a city about 15 miles away from where the murders happened, at his girlfriend's house with his girlfriend and also his girlfriend's sister and brother-in-law. And so as much as they wanted Hans to be their guy, the police learned, obviously he's not. And this was basically how the entire investigation went. The police would interview over 4,000 people, but despite all that, they still could not figure out who did this. And so slowly, the case went cold. And that was it for 44 years. Lots of theories, but not one suspect. But then, in 2004, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They said the killer was Nils Gustafsson, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Mela, who was the only one who survived the attack. And the prosecutors pointed to two pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first piece of evidence was there was this woman who was staying out at the lake on the night of the murders, not far from the teenagers' campsite, who remembered overhearing two men really aggressively fighting before the murders ultimately happened. Prosecutors hypothesized that what that woman overheard was Nils and Seppo fighting with each other. That Nils was mad at Seppo about something to do with Nils's girlfriend, Mela. Perhaps he really was upset that it seemed like Mela was flirting with Seppo, and so Nils felt betrayed, but, something was happening there where these two young men were fighting over a girl. In the prosecutor's eyes, this would also explain why Mela had been stabbed so many times. That basically Nils must have been so furious about whatever was happening between Mela and Seppo, and then, his rage took over and he really took it out on his girlfriend. The second piece of evidence the prosecutors used to support this idea that Nils was the killer were Nils's shoes, which were found under those leaves about 500 meters away from their campsite. The prosecutors said there was blood on the shoes, but not in the shoes. And none of the blood that were on these shoes belonged to Nils. And so prosecutors say that shows Nils murdered his friends while wearing his shoes and then, ran away from the campsite and ditched those shoes to hide them, underneath those leaves. And then he came back to the campsite and inflicted those horrible injuries on himself to make it seem like he also had been attacked. So in the end, Nils, 44 years after the fact, got arrested for these murders. And at the time he was arrested, Nils was 62 years old, he was working as a bus driver, and he was married with kids. But at Nils's trial, he absolutely maintained his innocence and did not waver from his story one bit. He basically said, look, I can't remember all the details of that day. I don't remember the attack very well. I don't really know what we did leading up to it, what happened after it. But what I do remember is I saw a dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. That's all I remember. And the jury completely believed him, and he was easily acquitted, and in the end, Finland would even give him a huge monetary settlement for his mental suffering. Today, people tell lots of stories about these murders. I mean, the lake itself where this happened, Lake Bodom, is now completely famous for these murders. People go there just to be in the same place where these teens were killed. But a lot of the stories that circulate about these murders are so far-fetched that they just do not seem believable, like suggesting that the campsite was cursed and that, the ghosts of murdered campers attacked the teens. It just does not seem like a viable theory. Other stories that circulate are really intriguing, but they don't really get you anywhere. Like periodically there's this photo that will circulate on the internet, and it's a picture of the crowd at one of the teens' funerals, and in the middle of this crowd is this guy whose face looks identical to that composite sketch of the running blonde man. And in fact, people have come out and said he looks exactly like that guy Hans Osman, who had shown up in the hospital, the day after the murders with the dirt and what looked like blood all over him, but he had that alibi. And so that picture makes its rounds on the internet, and everybody gets jazzed up and says, there he is, that's the guy who killed the teens. But no one's ever been able to actually identify that person, and so it's gone nowhere. But there is one story that circulates about these murders that a lot of people believe is the truth. When the teenagers were killed, there was a 55-year-old man named Carl Valdemar Gillstrom who lived right on Lake Bodom. And Carl had a reputation for being really nasty and sometimes even lashing out at the campers who stayed in this area. And in fact, Carl would often get drunk and literally go and attack the other campers. He would cut down their tents in the middle of the night, he would throw rocks at their campsite, and then one time, he even fired a gun at a camper who was riding past him on a moped. He missed, but I mean, this guy is an absolute nightmare. And so after the murders happened, locals who knew about Carl immediately went to police and they were like, that's the guy who very likely did this. I mean, this is totally something he would do. But when police went and tried to speak to Carl, they wound up speaking to Carl's wife, who was the kiosk woman, the woman who was so nasty to the teens when they first arrived and basically told them to get away. Yeah, so the police talked to her, and she would tell police that Carl was with her and her kids when the murders happened. And so the police believed her and never really considered Carl a serious suspect. But in the Lake Bodom area, when people heard he was not being looked at closely, people felt like this was a huge mistake. But 9 years after the murders, so at this point the case is totally cold, Carl is having a drink with his neighbor out near the Lake Bodom area, and as they're just sitting there having drinks, relaxing, Carl winds up admitting to the neighbor that he was the Lake Bodom murderer. He literally said to his neighbor, "Don't you understand that I'm the murderer of Bodom?" And the neighbor apparently was so caught off guard and so horrified by this that they said to Carl, well, if that's the truth, you should go drown yourself. And then the next day, where was Carl found? Out in the lake, drowned, right near where the teens had been attacked. Now, the police were never able to actually figure out if his death was accidental, or if he had done it to himself, or if somebody else had done it to him, but that's the story. And lots of people believe that Carl was so racked with guilt over what he had done that he did what his neighbor suggested. In the summer of 2013, a middle-aged man named Frank pulled into a tiny town in Nevada called Kingston. Kingston, which is home to less than 100 people year-round, is so small and desolate and cut off from the rest of the state and really the rest of the country that they don't even have stoplights. It's basically just a collection of a handful of buildings like a laundromat and a saloon that are surrounded on one side by this huge mountain range and on the other just open desert. At the time, there were really only two reasons you would find yourself in Kingston, Nevada. One, if you lived there or were visiting someone that lived there, or two, if you were going to visit the abandoned mines up in the mountain that are right near Kingston. Frank was in Kingston for the latter. For the last 5 years, Frank had been traveling all over Nevada and California and just the West Coast in general, exploring abandoned mines. And he would film himself while he was in there, and then when he got back to his house, he would upload the footage to his YouTube channel. When he arrived in Kingston, Frank had already uploaded 302 videos to his channel. But despite the very high number of videos on his channel was still very, very small, and it wasn't growing really at all. So for him to be dedicating that much time and energy into making these videos indicated that he wasn't really doing it for YouTube fame. He was doing it because he had a passion for exploring these mines, and he wanted to share it with the few people that subscribed to his channel. And when you look through the first 302 videos on his channel, that passion of his really comes through. He always knows the history of the mine he's about to go into, and when he goes inside, if he finds machinery or pieces of equipment that have been left behind, he immediately knows what they are, and he speaks about them with relative sophistication. He has this lingo that sounds like he understands mines on a really granular level. So when Frank arrived in Kingston in 2013, as far as we know, the only reason he was there was just to do what he always did, which is go explore a couple of cool mines, film it, and then put it on his channel. Except this time, Frank's adventure into these mines right outside of Kingston would be cut short by something he just could not explain. However, he captured it on film, and it's terrifying. The two mines that Frank was intending to visit were the Victorine mine and the Horton mine. The Horton mine was constructed first in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and when they built it, they expected it to be a gold mine, but there was no gold inside. So they constructed another mine about about 900 feet above where the entrance to the Horton mine was, they built this other mine, and inside of that mine, there was gold. This second mine they built was called the Victorine Mine. When they built the Victorine Mine, they bored this massive hole right outside the entrance to the Victorine Mine that went straight down 900 feet directly into the mountain, and this big hole they drilled went right into the Horton Mine. This was on purpose. They were basically building the equivalent of a laundry chute, except instead of tossing laundry down it, they would toss the ore they drilled from inside the Victorine Mine. They would drop it down the chute. It would fall 900 feet all the way to the Horton Mine, and that would save them from needing to carry all of this ore all the way down the mountain. Basically, it was a shortcut for the ore. And in the Horton Mine, they built this huge conveyor belt system so that anything that came off of the chute would land at the beginning of this conveyor belt, and it would get brought all the way outside of the mine where workers could process it and bring it to town. Finally, in 1989, the Victorine Mine ran out of gold, so they permanently shut down that mine as well as the Horton Mine. These two mines were located about 4 miles to the west of Kingston's town center. And so when Frank pulled into town, he moved to the western side of town and then found the access road that would bring him out to these mines. And so he just drove on this road that basically shot straight towards this huge mountain range. And after traveling about 4 miles, he reached this very sharp right turn that basically went straight up a mountain. And at this point, there's no more pavement on the road. It's a very narrow trail. It's hard to see. And so Frank would have parked his car, grabbed his camera and his equipment, and begun walking up this mountain. After quite a while, Frank would have passed a couple of rundown old cabins that were kind of overgrown. These cabins were used when these mines were in operation. They helped service the workers while they were out there. But since the mines were abandoned, so too were the cabins. And so when Frank got to these cabins, that would have meant he was very close to the entrance to both of these mines. Frank first went to the Victorine Mine, which would have been very easy to spot because right outside of its small entrance was this huge piece of what looked like scaffolding, and that was actually the opening to this huge chute that shot down 900 feet to the Horton Mine below. So Frank goes to the Victorine Mine and he has a look around, but either Frank didn't film his time inside of the Victorine Mine or he just didn't upload it because there's no video of him actually going into the Victorine Mine. His camera is turned on this particular day when he's left the Victorine Mine and he's walked all the way down to the entrance of the Horton Mine. And so we see this video. It opens up with the camera pointing at the entrance to the Horton Mine. And the entrance to the Horton Mine is very bizarre looking. The entrance, which is 20 feet tall, has all these long strips of metal plating that have been kind of anchored up all around the entrance to prevent the entrance from caving in on itself. But despite whatever functional value these copper plates might have had, the aesthetic result is very creepy and makes you not want to go in the entrance. Also, because this mine had been shut down, there's a big gate right in front of this already very foreboding entrance that warns people to not go inside. But Frank seems totally unaffected by this and just strolls right up to the entrance of Horton Mine, and he kind of talks about its history, and then he calmly steps over this warning gate telling people to stay back, and he begins walking into this mine. Right away, Frank notices there's quite a bit of water on the ground, and that's cause for concern.
Okay, we can go in here and just take a quick look. I don't think I'm going to explore this particular mine. There's a little bit too much water in here, and I know this mine is really old, but I just don't think it's wise to go in here when there's water. Try to avoid this if I can.
Frank's not concerned that there is water. It's that the water might be stagnant water. In these abandoned mines, there can be poisonous gases that accumulate, and when there is stagnant water, those gases get absorbed into the stagnant water. And so if Frank were to step into one of those puddles of water, he would release those gases from the water, the so-called bad air, and that can actually be deadly. But as Frank is standing there wondering if he should proceed, he looks down off to the left side, right inside the entranceway, and he notices there's some footprints. So somebody must have come in here recently, and so Frank decides, you know what, I'll go a little bit further in, I'll just be really careful of the water. Frank makes it about 10 feet inside of the entranceway when he lifts his camera up and he looks straight down into the mine, and you get your first look at really what the inside of this mine looks like. And right away, you notice there's this yellow kind of collapsed looking tubing that's hanging down from the ceiling, and that's the old old air filtration system. And then when Frank moves maybe another 5 or 10 feet farther into the mine, you see in addition to this air filtration system, there's also all these metal chains that are just kind of dangling from the ceiling, and they're all over the place. And both the tubing and the chains seem to extend all the way into the tunnel out of view. Those chains were previously used to hold up the conveyor belt that stretched the entire distance of this mine, which is 600 feet long. They held that conveyor belt up, which carried all of the ore from the chute out of the mine. Even though Frank has seen similar setups in other mines he's been into, he would say on camera that there's just something really off about this mine, that it was really sketching him out, and he wasn't really sure if he should keep going.
Yeah, this looks pretty sketchy. I'll go a few feet further in and check it out, but I think I'm going to pass on this one.
He would later reflect on that feeling he had inside of the mine, and he would say, you know, it felt like there was somebody else in that mine watching him. It was just very, very uncomfortable. And so as Frank is debating whether or not he should continue, just based on this kind of bad vibe he was getting, he looks down and notices there's actually running water now. Before at the entrance, it was stagnant, but now he can see the water inside of this mine. It's not stagnant, it's running, and so the risk of breathing in any bad air is pretty much gone, meaning this mine is relatively safe. But despite this supposedly positive development for someone who wanted to explore a mine, Frank is still not sure if he should continue.
This is one of the creepiest mine tunnels I've ever been in, just because of how dilapidated it is and all these chains hanging down from the overhead, and there's a shot looking down the tunnel even further,
But despite his apprehension, Frank ultimately decides, you know what, he'd come this far, I'll just go a little bit farther. And so Frank makes it to about 100 feet into this mine when he turns around and he films the opening, the entrance to the mine, which is all lit up with sunlight. And he films it kind of to give the audience a sense of just how far he had come into the mine. And so then, after filming the entrance, he turns the camera and he films back down towards the back of the mine, towards the actual end of the mine. Now, at first, you don't see anything unusual. You just see the chains, and it looks kind of like it had for the first couple of minutes of this video. But then, Frank pulls his flashlight out and he shines it down the hall.
looking down the tunnel here. I don't know why that one chain is swinging back there.
As we saw, Frank's initial reaction to this swinging chain is speechlessness, and then just sort of this weird statement of fact that he's like, I don't know how that chain is swinging. And then after staring at this chain and even zooming in on it, trying to kind of figure out what he's looking at, Frank eventually would just turn off his camera, turn around, and leave very quickly. And when he got back to his house, he uploaded this video to his channel with virtually no context. He just said, this is what I saw inside of the Horton mine, and nothing happened. It didn't go viral. It isn't like everybody went crazy when they saw this footage. Instead, I think his audience, they saw this video and didn't really know what to make of it. And then very quickly, his audience and Frank just kind of forgot about it. And Frank got back into making his kind of traditional videos. Then, about a year later, the YouTube algorithm kind of noticed this Horton mine footage that he had uploaded back in 2013, and it went crazy viral. And immediately, this video was put under the microscope by YouTube personalities, by TV personalities. I mean, everybody was just kind of taken aback by this footage. And what was determined fairly early on was the actual video itself was authentic. Frank really did film a swinging chain in the Horton mine in Nevada. The question became, who swung the chain? There are many people that believe Frank swung the chain, and this is all just one big hoax, and they point to some of his newer videos after this video went viral, where it appears that Frank is kind of actively going out to find paranormal activity versus just going out and exploring mines. And so they point to that and say, look, he's looking for this stuff. This can't be authentic. This video has to be fake. But others say, look, Frank is just a guy who likes going into mines, and he films the inside of these mines. He's been doing it for for years and years, and he just happened to be in one when something unexplainable happened, and he happened to catch it on film. And the only reason he began kind of actively looking for paranormal activity after it went viral is because kind of overnight, his channel exploded, and he suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of subscribers that all came from that swinging chain video, and they all wanted the same thing: more swinging chain videos, more paranormal content. And so, seeing a great opportunity, Frank went out and began looking for paranormal content. That's why most of his videos, after that video where the swinging chain happened, are kind of geared towards fishing for that kind of stuff. But that first video, that swinging chain video, there wasn't really a good incentive for Frank to fake it at the time he uploaded it. Obviously now you can say, oh, well, he staged it because he wanted it to go viral and he wanted to become famous and then have this great YouTube career. Look, it's all in front of us. It's so obvious. But how could Frank have possibly predicted that that video would go viral? Going viral is so hard, and it happens so rarely, and it's nearly impossible to predict. And so how could Frank, who had uploaded hundreds and hundreds of videos before, and none of them had come anywhere near virality, how could he have said, this is going to go viral? It's just such a long shot. It also seems very uncharacteristic for Frank to have been diligently uploading on this YouTube channel, which was basically a passion project, for 5 years. He's uploaded 302 videos, and all of them are the same. He's posting the same type of content very consistently for the same small, loyal following, and then out of left field, he uploads his ghost video with no context. Even if he was trying to go viral with this video, he would have known that the most likely outcome would be that the video did not go viral, and instead his small, loyal following that was used to a particular type of content would see this video and be like, why did he upload that? Or worse, they would think, is he faking this? Is this a hoax? And if so, that would totally tarnish his reputation, and he'd lose probably some of his precious few subscribers. I mean, it just didn't feel like the juice was worth the squeeze. But regardless, even though lots and lots of people have said, you're lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank, he said, I'm not lying. I was in the Horton mine. I filmed what I filmed. It's up to you what you believe. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you. at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's house, and right as the like button is sitting down to watch their favorite TV show, start violently vacuuming right in front of the TV. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and mugs and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The user